Sketch the graph of y equals arc sine x. So remember, that's the same as y equals sine inverse x. Same graph, just different notation. So that means this is the inverse of sine. So let's get an idea of some points for regular sine x so that we can connect it to its inverse. Now remember, we're only looking at from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. So I'm going to pick some angles in there. Negative pi over 2, negative pi over 4, negative pi over 6. These are all angles from my unit circle. 0, and then pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 2. So I know from my unit circle that sine of negative pi over 2 is negative 1. Sine of negative pi over 4 is negative square root 2 over 2, which is approximately negative 0.7. Sine of negative pi over 6 is negative 1/2. Sine of 0 is 0. Sine of pi over 6 is 1/2. Sine of pi over 4 is square root 2 over 2, which is 0.7. And sine of pi over 2 is 1. So now that I know this table, I can create another table that is going to be arc sine x. So remember, now my inputs are the y values of sine. Negative 1, negative 0.7, negative 1/2, 0, 1/2, 0.7, and 1. And my outputs are going to be my angles. Negative pi over 2, negative pi over 4, negative pi over 6, 0, pi over 6, pi over 4, and 1. So if I want to set up my axis, now my x values here are going to go from negative 1, this is negative 1/2 to 1. And my y values are now going to be my angles. So this is going to be pi over 2, pi over 4, pi over 6, negative pi over 6, pi over 4, and negative pi over 2. That negative kind of disappeared. So this is going to be x, and this axis is arc sine x. So now I can plot my points. Negative 1, negative pi over 2. Negative 0.7, which is about closer to negative 1, and negative pi over 4. Negative 1/2, negative pi over 6. 0, 0. 1/2 pi over 6. 0.7 pi over 4, and 1 pi over 2. This is my arc sine curve. And notice it's restricted within a domain from negative 1 to 1. And my range is from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. So you should be able to sketch cosine the same way, and we'll practice that in class.